He moved as a thought given form, a spear of pure intellect hurled across the void. Around him, the sea of souls churned, a tempest of raw emotion and nascent consciousness. This was his domain, the great ocean he had charted, where others saw only madness. He was its master, and he would use it to save them all. Below, a world of gold and marble slept under a psychic shield of impossible strength. A fortress of will built by the master of mankind. It was a lock, and he was the key. He had seen the future, a vision of fire and betrayal that would burn the galaxy to cinders. He had seen his brother, the brightest of them all, fall into darkness. The warning had to be delivered. Time had run out for fleets and astropaths. Only he could pierce the veil. Only he could reach his father in time. This was not a plea. It was a necessity. And so he pushed. He gathered the arcane energies, the forbidden lore, the terrible power he had been offered and believed he controlled. He focused it all into a single incandescent point. The wards of Terra, woven from the Emperor's own mind, groaned under the strain. They fractured like glass. They screamed. He did not hear their warning. He heard only the ticking clock of galactic doom. With a final cataclysmic effort, he broke through. He shattered the aegis of his father's making and plunged into the heart of the Imperium. He was Magnus the Red, and he had come to save the world by breaking it. The scale of his transgression was not merely in the breaking of an oath. It was in the violation of a fundamental law of the new reality his father sought to build. The Great Crusade was an engine of illumination, an armed philosophy intended to drive the shadows of old night from the galaxy. At its heart was the imperial truth, that there were no gods, no spirits, no demons. There was only the material universe, governed by science and reason. Humanity, united and enlightened, would be its own salvation. The storm-racked dimension of the warp was a navigational hazard, a source of psychic phenomena to be studied with caution, but nothing more. It was a tool, not a pantheon. Yet for Magnus and his legion, the 15th, the 1,000 Suns, this was a beautiful lie. They were scholars born, librarians in power armor. To them, the warp was not some howling void, but the great ocean, teeming with life and meaning, a source of infinite knowledge for those with the courage to look. Their home, Prospero, was a world of gleaming cities and tranquil reflection, a monument to the unlocked potential of the human mind. Their psychic gifts were not a mutation to be feared, but an evolution to be embraced. Magnus, the Cyclops, the Crimson King, saw further than any of his brothers. He saw the hypocrisy at the core of the imperial truth. The Emperor, the greatest psyker in existence, who used the warp to bind his Imperium together through the light of the Astronomicon and the whispers of the astropaths, now forbade its deeper study. He forbade the very path to enlightenment that had made him master of them all. This contradiction came to a head at a place called Nikaea. It was a trial, though it was not called such. A council to determine the fate of psychic power in the legions. On one side stood Magnus, arguing for control, for education, for mastery over the Imperium. He spoke of the Librarius Project, of training warrior scholars to harness their gifts for the good of the Imperium. He spoke of knowledge as a light, not a contagion. Against him stood the grim, pragmatic Mortarian and the feral, superstitious Leman Russ. They spoke of mutation, of corruption, of the dangers inherent in trafficking with the unseen. They saw sorcery where Magnus saw science. They saw damnation where he saw apotheosis. And when all arguments were spent, the Emperor, seated upon a throne of judgment, delivered his verdict. It was an edict absolute and without appeal. The Librarius was to be disbanded. The legions were to cease all use of psychic powers beyond the sanction navigate and communicate. the study of the warp was forbidden. For Magnus, it was a profound humiliation. It was a rejection not just of his methods, but of his very being. His father had looked upon him, upon his sons, upon their entire culture of enlightened inquiry, and declared it profane. He was ordered to return to Prospero and to become what he was not, a simple soldier, blind to the greater truths of the cosmos. He complied, but he did not obey. For Magnus the Red believed he knew better. In his magnificent, tragic arrogance, he believed his wisdom surpassed that of the Father who had made him. This pride would become the fulcrum upon which the fate of the galaxy would turn. On the silent, crystalline spires of Tizca, Magnus did not cease his work. He merely cloaked it in deeper secrecy. He and his inner circle, the masters of the Legion's esoteric arts, delved further into the great ocean than ever before. They saw it as their solemn duty. If the Emperor would blind himself to the true nature of reality, then they would be his eyes. They would watch for dangers he refused to see, and they would be ready. It was in this state of vigilant disobedience that the vision came. It was not a simple premonition, but a psychic scream that echoed across the stars. Magnus cast his astral form out into the void, seeking the source, and found it on a swamp world called Davin. He saw his most beloved brother, Horus Lupercal, the War Master himself, struck down by a foul blade. He watched in horror as Horus's soul was dragged into the Imperium, where the great powers of the warp, the very entities the Emperor denied, feasted on his pride and his pain. They whispered promises of power, of freedom, of vengeance against a tyrannical father. Magnus saw the entire tapestry of the heresy laid bare. He saw Horus's pact. He saw the legions that would turn, the worlds that would burn, the civil war that would drown the Emperor's dream in blood. The knowledge was a poison. It demanded action. He had to warn his father. But the Edict of Nikaea had hamstrung him. The official channels were too slow, too unreliable. An astropathic message could be intercepted, corrupted. A fleet would take months, years to reach Terra. By then it would be too late. Horus's betrayal was already in motion. The only path was the one forbidden to him. He would have to use his own power, a psychic message of such force and clarity that it could not be ignored or misunderstood. It would be the greatest feat of telepathy ever attempted, a direct projection of his mind into the Sanctum Imperialis itself. But even for Magnus, the psychic wards around the throne world were thought to be inviolable. He would need more power. And so, in his desperation, he did what he had always done. He sought knowledge. He reached out into the great ocean, seeking a guide, a power that could show him the way. An entity answered. It presented itself not as a demon, but as a being of pure intellect, a dispassionate keeper of secrets. It called itself Tzinch, the architect of fate. It offered Magnus the key to bypass his father's wards, the raw power needed to deliver his warning. Magnus, in the depths of his hubris, believed he was making a pact with an equal. He thought he could take the offered power, use it for his noble purpose, and then set it aside. He did not understand that the gift was a hook. He did not see that the entity was not a guide, but a puppeteer, and he was taking the first willing step onto its stage. He accepted the bargain, and in doing so, sealed his fate and the fate of billions. The power that flooded into him was intoxicating, immense. It felt like enlightenment. It was damnation. The ritual was a symphony of forbidden energies. At the apex of his personal pyramid on Prospero, Magnus stood at the center of a circle of his most powerful sorcerers. They were the conductors of his will, gathering the legion's collective psychic might and pouring it into their Primarch. His physical body became a statue of red stone as his astral self, now swollen with borrowed power, ascended. He was no longer a man, he was a psychic missile, a living word of warning aimed at the heart of the Imperium. He plunged into the immaterium, and this time, the journey was different. He was not an observer skimming its surface. He was a tidal wave moving within it. The power of Siege was a gale at his back, propelling him, guiding him, showing him the secret paths and hidden currents. He felt the laughter of thirsting gods, the screams of lost souls, the grand, terrible music of chaos, and he mistook it for the sound of the universe itself. Then he saw it, Terra, a beacon of order in the roaring chaos of the warp. But it was sheathed, protected by a layered defense of pure psychic energy that shimmered with the Emperor's own power. It was a masterpiece of psychic engineering, a shield that had stood for millennia. No demon had ever breached it, no psychic probe had ever passed it. Magnus felt a moment of awe, then a surge of pride. He would be the first. He drove his consciousness forward, the power of the architect of fate his battering ram. The outer wards screamed as he struck them. They flexed, they held, they began to crack. He felt the resistance, the sheer, unimaginable force of his father's will pushing back. For a fleeting instant, a sliver of his old self, the scholar, the son, felt a tremor of profound doubt, a sense of sacrilege. This was a holy place. This was a violation. What he was doing was an act of immense violence against his father's greatest work. But then the vision of Horus returned, of burning fleets and dying worlds, and his resolve hardened. The Imperium was at stake. What was one broken shield compared to a galaxy? He poured more of the borrowed power into the assault. He gave himself over to it completely. With a final soul-shattering surge, he broke through. The psychic shock wave of his arrival was not a whisper, it was an explosion. He did not slip through the wards, he demolished them. His astral form, a comet of crimson energy, tore through the delicate machinery of the Imperial Palace's psychic defenses. He expected to find himself in the throne room before his father. Instead, he crashed into a place he did not know existed, a cavernous, secret space deep beneath the mountains of Himalaya. Before him stood the breathtaking scale of the Emperor's secret, ultimate ambition, the Golden Throne, and connected to it, a shimmering, stable gateway into the alien labyrinth of the Webway. This was his father's endgame. A human-controlled path through the galaxy, free from the storms of the warp. A way to cut humanity off from the influence of the chaos gods forever, starving them into oblivion. It was a dream of mankind's ultimate ascension, and Magnus, in his desperate, arrogant flight, had just become its destroyer. His psychic intrusion, tainted and empowered by the raw energy of Siege, was a contagion. It hit the delicate mechanisms of the Webway gate like a sledgehammer. The portal shuddered, its stable energies corrupted. It buckled, it tore open. And from the other side, from the raw warp itself, demons poured through. The breach was instantaneous, catastrophic. The elite custodian guard, the Emperor's own companions, were instantly beset by a tide of horrors they were never meant to face within the sanctum itself. He had not just broken a door to deliver a message. He had blown a hole in the wall of reality, and hell was now flooding in. His momentum carried him onward through the unfolding disaster, his astral form finally coalescing before the Golden Throne itself. He saw his father not as an emperor in state, but as a scientist in his laboratory. His concentration focused on the monumental task of controlling the Webway. Magnus screamed his warning, the words tumbling out of his psychic projection, laced with the horror of what he had just witnessed. "Father, it is Horus! Horus has turned against you. He is a traitor. fallen to the powers of the warp. The message was delivered. The terrible truth was spoken. Magnus waited for the shock, the denial, the rage. He received none of it. The Emperor of Mankind turned his gaze from the collapsing portal to the spectral form of his son. And in that gaze, Magnus saw no surprise. He saw only an abyss of sorrow, a weariness that was older than mountains, and a cold, terrible fury that was the death of stars. In that single silent moment of contact, Magnus understood everything his father had known. Perhaps not the specifics, not the name, not the time, but he had known of the great enemy, of the coming betrayal. The warning was not new information. It was merely the confirmation of a long-held fear. And with that understanding came the second, more terrible revelation: the true cost of his action. He saw his folly not as his father saw it, but in its full galactic context. He had not saved the Imperium, he had doomed it. The Webway Project was humanity's only true path to victory against chaos. The one strategy the ruinous powers could not counter. It was a future of peace, of enlightenment, of freedom from the predators of the Imperium. And he, Magnus the Red, in his quest for knowledge and his belief in his own wisdom, had shattered it beyond repair. He had not just opened a gate for demons, he had slammed shut the door on mankind's best and only hope. The Emperor would now be forced to commit himself to the Golden Throne, not as a ruler, but as a psychic warden, his mind becoming a living seal against the breach Magnus had created. He would be trapped, a prisoner in his own palace, holding back the tide of damnation with his own life force, unable to lead his armies, unable to face Horus directly. And then, the final piece fell into place. Magnus felt the tendrils of the power he had borrowed from Tzeentch tighten around his soul, no longer a gift, but a chain. He heard the changer of ways laughing in the depths of the warp. It had all been a setup. His vision of Horus's fall, his desperation, his choice to use sorcery, all of it had been orchestrated. He was not a savior. He was a weapon, aimed and fired by the very enemy he sought to expose. His warning did not prevent the heresy, it enabled it. It pinned the Emperor to his throne, ensuring the War Master would go unopposed in the opening stages of his rebellion. He had been played from the very beginning. He was not a master of the great ocean, he was just another drowning man. The psychic backlash threw his spirit from the throne world, casting it back across the tormented void to the still form of his body on Prospero. He awoke with a scream that was both psychic and physical, a sound of absolute soul-crushing despair. The knowledge of his failure was not an intellectual concept. It was a physical weight, a poison in his blood. He had betrayed everyone, everything. He had betrayed his sons by leading them down a path of lies. He had betrayed his father by destroying his greatest dream. He had betrayed humanity by guaranteeing its eternal war against the darkness. He tried to explain it to his closest advisor, Ahriman, but the words were ash in his mouth. How could he articulate a failure of such cosmic magnitude? How could he tell his children that their entire philosophy, their lifelong quest for enlightenment, was nothing more than a lure in a trap set by a malevolent god? He could not. And so he withdrew into himself, into a catatonic state of nihilistic grief, awaiting the punishment he knew he deserved. It came not as a quiet arrest, but as a storm of fire and iron. The fleets of the 6th Legion, the Space Wolves, materialized in orbit over Prospero. Their Primarch, Leman Russ, the Emperor's executioner, had been sent to bring Magnus to heel. But the orders had been subtly altered by the master of the nascent heresy, Horus himself. Russ was not told to arrest his brother, he was told to destroy him. The orbital bombardment began without warning. Las lances and macro cannon shells rained down on the silver spires of Tizca. Libraries that held the accumulated knowledge of 1,000 worlds burned. Peaceful scholars and citizens who had never held a weapon were incinerated in the first salvos. The immaculate city, a jewel of reason and art, was reduced to rubble and ruin. The 1,000 Suns, caught completely by surprise, mounted a desperate defense, but their hearts were not in it. Their Primarch, their father, was silent, broken in his sanctum, refusing to give orders, refusing to even acknowledge the attack. He accepted the judgment. This was his penance. He would let his legion die, let his world burn, as payment for his sin. He watched through the eyes of his sons as the savage wolves made planetfall, their chain axes and bolters tearing through the ranks of his scholars. He felt every death as a fresh wound upon his already shattered soul. This was justice. This was the end. But as the slaughter reached its crescendo, as the last redoubts of the 1,000 Suns prepared to fall, another voice whispered in his mind. It was not his own conscience. It was the silken, tempting voice of the architect of fate. It showed him another path. It told him that this did not have to be the end. His sons did not have to die for his mistake. Their knowledge did not have to be turned to ash. There was a sanctuary, a place where they would be safe, where their powers would not be condemned but celebrated. A new world was waiting for them. All he had to do was reach out and take it. Ahriman and the surviving masters of the Legion found him in his chamber, pleading with him to act, to save them. They saw their brothers being butchered, their home annihilated, and their father lost in despair. They could not understand his inaction. Magnus looked at their desperate faces. He looked out upon the burning ruins of his perfect city, a funeral pyre for his ideals. He saw the snarling wolves of Fenris. Instruments of an Imperium he now saw as a brutal, ignorant cage. He had already committed the ultimate treason against his father's dream. He was already damned beyond any hope of redemption. What was one more sin? One more? What was one more betrayal in the face of annihilation? The grief and shame that had paralyzed him finally curdled into a cold, burning rage. He had tried to save them, and they had sent the wolves. Very well, he would save himself. He reached out with his mind, not to his father, not to his brothers, but to the entity in the warp that had offered him a lifeline. He accepted the deal. The sky over Prospero tore open. A vortex of raw, kaleidoscopic energy erupted from the planet's core, a maelstrom of unreality. The material laws of physics ceased to apply. The burning city of Tizca, the fighting legions, the very bedrock of the planet itself, were lifted up and drawn into the eye of terror. The space wolves on the surface were annihilated by the psychic backlash or cast back to their ships, left to stare at an empty sector of space where a world had once been. Prospero was gone. In its place, within the pandemonium of the eye, it was reformed. It became the planet of the sorcerers, a world of shifting crystal labyrinths and impossible geometries, a haven and a prison in equal measure. Magnus the Red and the tattered remnants of the 1,000 Suns were saved from physical death, but in that moment of translation, they were lost to the Imperium, to humanity, and to their own souls forever. Magnus had made his final choice not out of a lust for power, but out of the deepest despair a soul could endure. He had chosen survival over honor, damnation over extinction. His physical form, already immense, was twisted and remade by the energies he had embraced. He was no longer a son of the Emperor. He was a creature of the warp, a demon Primarch, his soul bound for eternity to the service of Tzeentch. His skin was the color of blood. his features warped into a form both majestic and monstrous. His single eye, once a symbol of his focused insight, now blazed with the fires of raw sorcery. He had become a living monument to hubris, a king of ashes on a throne of lies. Yet unlike so many of his traitor brothers who reveled in their new forms, a part of Magnus remembered. He was eternally haunted by the silent, sorrowful gaze of his father. He could still see the shimmering gateway of the Webway and feel the sickening crunch as his psychic might tore it asunder. His every thought, his every scheme, his every act of vengeance against the Imperium was colored by the bitter taste of that singular, catastrophic failure. His endless quest for knowledge was no longer a noble pursuit of enlightenment. It was a desperate search for a spell, a ritual, an arcane secret powerful enough to either undo his sin or grant him the final oblivion he secretly craved. His failure continued to cascade downwards, infecting his legion. The flesh change, the curse of their genetics, accelerated wildly in the mutable environment of the Eye of Terror. In a desperate attempt to halt it, his first captain, Ahriman, cast a mighty spell. The rubric of Ahriman saved the legion from mutation, but at a terrible cost. It turned every legionary not possessed of immense psychic power into a soulless automaton, their dust sealed within their power armor, animated only by the will of their sorcerous masters. Magnus's original sin had damned them, and his son's attempt to save them had damned them again. Such was the legacy of the Crimson King. Across the long millennia, his hatred for the Imperium festered, but it was always sharpest, most personal, when directed at Leman Russ and his wolves. The feud between the Cyclops and the Wolf King became a legend, a saga of vengeance that spanned 10,000 years. It was a war of philosophy fought with bolt gun and spell fire, the damned scholar against the savage warrior, each forever defining himself in opposition to the other. Each encounter was a fresh reopening of the same wound, a reminder of the day the libraries burned and a legion was broken. Yet even in his damnation, a ghost of his former self remained. A shard of his soul, splintered off in the psychic cataclysm of his assault on Terra, was found and preserved by the Imperium. This fragment retained the loyalty, the nobility, the tragic desire to do good that had once defined him. It was a constant, agonizing reminder of the man Magnus could have been, proof that his intentions were not born of malice, but of a flawed and arrogant love. This only deepened the tragedy. He was not a monster who chose evil, but a hero who had stumbled into it and now could not find his way back. As a prince of Tzinch, he became a master of deceit and manipulation, his plots echoing across the galaxy. But he was a king in a gilded cage. Every victory was hollow, for it ultimately served the will of the god he had once thought an ally. He had won survival for his sons, but at the cost of their very souls and his own eternal freedom. And so he watches now as darkness closes on the galaxy once more. From the impossible towers of the planet of the sorcerers, his single cyclopean eye, filled with an eternity of regret, gazes out upon the Imperium he helped to ruin. The central crushing irony of his existence remains. He saw the truth of Horus's betrayal before any other. His warning was accurate, his motive was pure, and yet the telling of it was a greater disaster than the secret itself. His story is the ultimate cautionary tale, a lesson on the lethal nature of knowledge without wisdom, of power without restraint. He sought forbidden lore to save his father's dream, and in the process became the instrument that shattered it. He broke the lock on his father's house only to find he had brought the walls crashing down. In the silent depths of the warp, the Crimson King still whispers his warning of betrayal. But 10,000 years of sorrow have changed its meaning. It is no longer a plea to save a beloved father. It is a curse upon a galaxy he both loves and hates. A galaxy he is forever bound to torment, forever haunted by the memory of the day he tried to save it. The dust of Prospero, the dust of his failure, clings to him still, an eternal shroud